Well, thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm really excited about today's discussion. It's a topic that I think something about which we are all interested. And we have two super inspired, experienced, knowledgeable experts joining us today. And I'm excited about this because I'm hoping to learn from you guys, and I know I will. Let me introduce who we'll be speaking with today. We've got Jeff Tucker from Zillow. He's the senior economist there on Zillow's economic research team. He combines Zillow's industry-leading real estate database with macroeconomic and demographic data to explain the forces that shape, the American housing market. He likes to delve into affordability, household formation, housing supply. He's a frequent presenter at conferences, industry gatherings, local and national news outlets, including Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, NPR's Marketplace. He's got a master in economics from University of Washington. And he is so knowledgeable and insightful. I got a chance to speak with him a little earlier, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say. Also joining us is Mike Schwartz, who I get to hear a lot, and thankfully so. Mike is a senior vice president at the agency. He's part of our leadership team at the agency. He focuses on new market strategies as we continue to scale globally. Mike is one of the most energetic, passionate guys I've met, super knowledgeable in economics. He brings a unique perspective to it in that he has been within the industry for 20 years now, roughly. He has spent the last 6 or so in managing agents, sales management. He was a manager with Coldwell Banker as well as with Compass, and we are so blessed and privileged and honored to have him as part of the agency team now. So let's jump into it. I mean, we're in a very unusual, singularly, I think, vexing, complex, hard to understand economy and real estate market. And I'm hoping that you guys can give me and everyone else who's here some kind of glimpse of what is going on and what we can expect. So Jeff, let's start with you. What's your take on today's housing market?
Sure, thanks. At a 30,000 foot view, what I'm seeing today this spring is that we have ended up in a surprisingly normal place for home price appreciation this spring, but we got there due to some really abnormal factors. And I say it's surprising to see normal price appreciation this spring because of where we were just 6 or 7 months ago, where home prices were actually falling. The market was cooling down a lot in the second half of 2022. We know that was the impact of high mortgage rates. They kind of hit buyers, they hit affordability, they also hit sellers. So where I see things today is that buyers and sellers have both been kind of digesting that and coming to terms with the fact that we're in a 6.5% mortgage rate world. We're not in the 3% mortgage rate world anymore. So this spring, buyers have kind of been making their way back. They're still, we're still down substantially from last year's kind of volume, but sellers are down by even more, basically. That there's just so few listings on the market that is really driving the dynamics and competition and price appreciation this spring, that we've got essentially very few new listings hitting the market, just sort of record low for April to actually have this few listings coming on the market. And so the buyers who are back are actually finding themselves competing for those, ending up in multiple offer situations once again, pushing up the prices a bit. And so here we are. We just updated our forecast that we're going to have probably about 3.9% price growth for calendar year 2023. In the background of that, though, I'm sort of saying the buyers are still down a bit, sellers are down even more. Put that together for folks in the industry, that does mean less sales volume. We're consistently seeing, our latest weekly numbers is maybe about 20% fewer new pending sales any given week than we had a year ago. That's an improvement from negative 40% year over year back in November, which was really the bottom of the doldrums. So we're kind of getting along with little less activity, but folks are finding prices where they can actually transact, and we're actually back to a world of, gradually rising prices.
So, as we know, markets are supply and demand driven. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that while we've seen a decline in buyer demand due to, among other factors, rising interest rates, which have affected affordability for buyers, probably a diminution in wealth as a result of Bitcoin and stock market declines, and perhaps a belief that the market is declining. We're seeing buyers coming off the market into the sidelines, and we would therefore expect that we're getting into a buyer's market because there's less demand. But on the other hand, and I know you guys are in much better command of these specs than these data points than I am. There are so many people that have these, under 4% mortgages and are locked in or have the benefit of these 30-year terms, that they don't need to sell net right now. They're not motivated. They're hearing from agents like us that, the market is, moving more slowly. There's far less sales. So we're seeing, we're starting here from, 2 years ago, year ago, whatever, where demand was higher than supply. We've seen demand decrease, but at the same time, we've also seen supply decrease. So we're seeing kind of a continued equilibrium, in this, and which is why I think we're seeing this appreciation in prices that you're projecting. Mike, what's your observations from the ground? I mean, you're dealing with, lots of agents. What are some of the perplexities that agents are, bringing to you? How are you helping them get through this time?
I think and Jeff, that was so well said. So thank you for that. And Billy, good to see you as always. I think just giving some more flair to what you were just talking about, Billy, and what Jeff was putting forward with this supply demand, just to put some numbers here, right? There are 82,513,000 homes in the United States of America per census data that can transfer, right? Like that's our number. We actually know the number of homes that exist. And right now in the entire nation, there are only 563,000 homes for sale. Like that's our most recent Federal Reserve data. And last month, there were 562,000 homes available for sale. Like it increased by 1,000 nationwide. So to give like an analysis to just like see what we're seeing, it's astounding, this lock-in effect. Like you basically have a 50-50 dichotomy of how many people have a mortgage versus don't have a mortgage out of those homes. And of the half that have a mortgage, 90% of them are in a rate under 5 and 80% of them are in a rate under 4, right? So, and honestly, 70% are in a rate under 3, right? So you have this insane reality where people are not letting go of their homes. So that is what's pushing this reality where we do have on the ground multiple offers, right? And people are like, what happened? I thought we were going to have this housing crash. I thought this was going to happen. I thought that was going to happen. It's like, yeah, but it's still supply and demand. So there's 330 million people and a lot of them want to own homes. And if there's only 500,000 available for sale, even though the rates jumped and doubled, you still have more buyers than sellers. And that's what it's coming down to at the end of the day. And just from a historical perspective, we saw this one other time. Jeff and I were talking about this, last time. In the late 1970s, the rates also doubled. Now that time they went from 8 to 16. But you have the same phenomenon of a lock-in effect. People saying, I don't want to let go of my 8, right? So if rates double in a 1 to 2 year period, you have this phenomenon where a lot of home sellers say, yeah, I'm not going to buy. And in a market where 2/3 of home buyers are previous sellers, that's really going to crush our normal reality. So when Jeff's like, yeah, we're seeing this like return to normal appreciation, agreed. But in pre-pandemic life, you'd have 1.5 million homes available for sale right now. And currently we have 500,000. So that's our entire reality, and that's the story, and that's why we're seeing what we're seeing, which is on the ground, Billy, multiple offers, right? That's the reality.
So here in LA, we have what we call Caravan, where real estate agents go running around town and seeing all of the other agents' listings. It's a 3-hour period during which we race and run in and out and see as much as we can so we can become as knowledgeable about the market as possible. And after that, we come together at our headquarters office and we talk about various topics. Yesterday, our topic was, who's seeing what in the market, who's been involved in bidding situations, who has properties that are just sitting. And yesterday I took an informal poll and asked agents, who's been involved in a bidding war in the last 30 days. A lot of hands, both from a listing side and from a buyer side. Many of them had over like a half a dozen offers. I then asked people, how, going through a progression of pricing, how many of those were under 2.5? How many of those were under 5? Or I should say, we're 2.5 and under. How much were 5 and over? How much were 10 and over? I didn't even have to really get beyond that because almost all of them were under, say, 3 or so. So, when we talk about this rate appreciation, Jeff, in the, I think you said 3.9 or whatever, 3+ range, are we looking at really kind of this is a national, every kind of product? Do you guys look at luxury type product and how is that affecting, do you look at like over a certain threshold of dollar and in the strata or the strata, various tranches of pricing, how does that look across the board?
Yeah, that's a great question. So those numbers I was giving are really looking at that middle third of the market, but we break out a bunch of our stats by essentially top third, middle third, bottom third. So you could call that luxury tier, mid-tier, entry-level tier. And what we saw nationwide was really a sharper slowdown in the luxury tier and a sharper slowdown in demand last year. That absolutely, that sent we sort of keep a different price index for each of those tiers. Our national price index is just for the middle tier, but the top tier index went negative year over year this spring. The price growth turned negative. We have seen those price declines. When we look around geographically, it's a very similar story where demand was hit hardest and we saw the biggest price declines on the West Coast. From here in Seattle, where I'm based, down through the Bay Area, had the biggest price declines from peak last year, like a 12% drop from peak to trough, and certainly down to SoCal as well. So what we did see there was, just a very sharp pullback in demand for those top tier priced homes. And I think what's interesting looking ahead, how much is that going to continue depends a bit on that supply response. I thought you set it up well, where we saw, demand step down, but supply step down even further nationally. Well, it's a bit belated, and it seems like sellers have sort of gotten that message. It took them longer to get that message last year. But there's a similar phenomenon happening in the top tier now, where I do think the sellers who can afford to wait are pulling back. The rich are just like you and me, except they've got more money, right? So since they got the resources, they also potentially have the luxury of time to wait until it's a more favorable market to sell in. So we are seeing that response. When we look at like the markets that had the very biggest pullback in new listings this spring, it was Seattle, San Francisco, San Jose, these pricey, also kind of tech heavy markets. And so I do think we haven't yet fully seen the effect of that, of sort of leading to more of those bidding wars. For the bidding wars to really come back, we need to see that demand come back. And as you've got your finger on the pulse there, and it's not yet back for those 5 million and up homes. That demand pressure is not back. I think that's also a segment of the market that's really tuned in to the macroeconomic news. They're tuned into the cost of borrowing and their alternative investment options. So the buyers in that luxury tier also have a bit more of that kind of luxury of time. They're not so much, that family, who's cramped in an apartment trying to buy their first home before the second kid comes along. That family is like, screw it. Okay, 6% interest rates. I got to buy something. I'm getting out the door. And that's why I think at the other end of things, that entry level tier really has held up impressively. Like the demand kind of keeps coming for those entry level homes.
Yeah, I think that we know of those reasons why people need to buy and sell. There's death, there's divorce. I call it downsizing. Their kids leaving the nest. There's those are sort of the less discretionary reasons. Some are design and birth, so we're obviously going to continue to see sales and buys occur because for those necessities of life. But you say that the wealthier or the richer, just like you and me, but I the super wealthy that I seem to come across always seem to suggest at least they believe that they're smarter. And of course, every wealthy client I've said dealt with in the last 5 years have all said how the market is going to collapse. I've had literally billionaire clients looking for 5-6 years saying it's about to crumble, and we're finally maybe getting to that place. I personally believe that developers are going to probably be the leading edge of that on the higher level, because I think that they bought properties 3-4 years ago. They thought, no way would they be sitting around holding them. They were based off the projections on an escalating market, and based on construction pricing and lending pricing that was quite different from today. I also read recently that there was a disparity perhaps in the changes in values when we compare the West Coast and the East Coast, potentially because of the tech world movement and desire. And also, I think maybe there's more density to a degree East Coast. And when work from home came, we had a greater escalation West Coast and warmer based, and then the East Coast market kind of cooled while the West Coast market, or west of Mississippi, I think it was, kind of elevated. Anything you guys want to add to any of that?
Sure. First of all, I mean, you hit it right there when you started going down to remote work, right? I mean, that's been a huge component of the housing surge that we saw. The San Francisco Fed did a study on this, and they were like, hey, like a big chunk of real estate appreciation is very much tied to remote work, fueling second home purchases. The reality is the butterfly effect is very real in real estate, right? And in 2009, there was a recovery. There you go. That's the official butterfly effect. In 2009, there was a recovery that had started after the Great Recession. And then Greece was about to default on their debt, and it crushed the recovery, like right in. And then in 20, because everyone thinks about 2013 as being the recovery, but there were two initial starts that had happened, neither one which took off. In 2011, there was another recovery that started, and then that was hampered by, wait for it, the debt ceiling crisis that happened in 2011, which totally, crushed that particular recovery. So now we're seeing another one. So let's hope history doesn't repeat itself right now with the debt ceiling discussions going on, because we don't need what's happening right now to be, destroyed by interest rates suddenly jumping 3, 4, 5 points, or who knows what. Jeff would know better, but that's no small detail. But the reality is, part of the upsurge that we're seeing right now in real estate is also tied to the collapse of SVB and the banking run, which people initially thought, oh my gosh, is the world going to end? Are we going to have the whole repeat of 2008? What it really did was it took the 10-year yield from 4.2, where it had been hovering for a couple of months, basically, brought it down to 3.5, which in turn lowered mortgage rates, which in turn spiked a little bit of demand that we have seen. I would encourage everyone on this call, start every morning by checking the 10-year yield, and it's going to basically tell you where that 30-year fixed is going. At the height of the pandemic, that 10-year yield was down to 0.3%, right? Which was why our rates were sitting at 2.5 to 3%. Now we have, the yield around 3.5 where it's been stabilizing. You want to watch that because at 3.5, we're going to have this little bit of resurgence. If that drops to 3, you probably will see a lot more multiple offers. If it goes back up to 4 or higher, we're going to see a damper again, right? So we very much can look at the macro, bring it right into what's happening in our local backyard. Billy, right now in LA with the writer's strike, honestly, that is a big deal for LA real estate, right? So we can talk about all these macro numbers. If you're a company town and the last time there was a strike in 2007, it was a $2.1 billion hit to the Los Angeles economy, right? So what's going on in your backyard is always going to matter the most for real estate. We can just look at the actives divided by the pendings, and we're going to have a rough idea of what's happening in real estate. But there's no doubt that what we're seeing on these macro figures right now hit us more because of how much people are paying attention to that, right? Oh, what's inflation at? What's the Fed doing? Because people are so dialed into it, it's having such an impact on the micro level as people feel more confident, right? Inflation has been tracking at 3.3% for the last 6 months. If people start feeling better, like inflation is more under control, then they feel more relaxed about making a purchase that's going to be in their universe for decades to come.
Yeah, I think that, you brought up a number of items that I'd actually written down as things to cover. And I think the world has become so global. The marketplaces have become so global. We're so intertwined. It used to be, the states were an island. We operated completely independently from everyone. And now, of course, if you're a listing agent, you have, sellers who are looking for your, Russian, Chinese, Hong Kong, European, whatever, silver bullet buyer. And we certainly are a global market now, but I think beyond just where your buyers are coming from, things around the world are impacting one another. We have had a number of things nationally and locally here in LA, nationally with the debt ceiling, nationally with the bank failures, the Fed increases, the WGA strike, which, affects not just LA, but also, other states where they do a lot of shooting.
It's going to affect Atlanta. It's going to affect Atlanta. Atlanta's been seeing
exactly
huge upsurge in filming. The Georgia market is going to be hit by the WGA strike.
Yeah. Jeff, since you track, I'm assuming you are tracking beyond, you're deep into the national. But are you, what are you forecasting in terms of, watching internationally how it may impact us?
Yeah, that's a great, we only need to look back a little over a year to see the impact of the invasion of Ukraine and energy prices spiking and extra kind of impulse to inflation that's totally outside the Fed's control. I kind of looking on the horizon for like what's the next like Greece debt crisis or something is very tough. We kind of fight the last war in many cases with policymaking and sort of look out for those hazards. I think it's been really interesting. It's almost been a bit of a canary in the coal mine to watch other Anglophone countries, the UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, watching their real estate markets and seeing how they react to shifting from a 40-year run into lower and lower zero, nearly zero interest rates, spiking way up. That has slowed their real estate markets a lot. New Zealand is actually kind of seeing prices decline pretty measurably. But when folks, I think maybe what's more interesting from these other countries is almost just a bit of a warning of how bad affordability can get. People look at, okay, the mortgage payment is up now over 30% of median household income in the US. It was in the low 20s just all through the 2010s. And they conclude, therefore, it's got to come back down. This is unsustainable. This is impossible. It's too unaffordable. The market, surely the market will crash soon. You might be holding your breath. You might be waiting for a long time, because when I look around at other countries like Canada and New Zealand and the UK, they make America look incredibly affordable. Just the cost of homeownership relative to income is much higher in those other Anglophone countries. And if anything, maybe the takeaway was we actually had kind of a golden era of affordability from 2012 to 2019. the last kind of glimmer back into it with when rates plunged in 2020 and 2021. So I often sort of say, yeah, these international comparisons can be a bit of a benchmark to say, oh, we didn't know how good we had it in the US by comparison to Canada. I mean, when I talk to folks considering, looking in Toronto or Vancouver, and I hear their incomes are much, much lower than someplace like Seattle, and yet their prices are more expensive. That, their prices are like they're like Silicon Valley type prices to own a house in those markets. But they do not have, virtually no one has a Silicon Valley salary. The other place, starting with CA that I look to as an example of how unaffordable homes can be and can kind of remain is California. I've sometimes said that the last couple of years have been like the Californication of the United States. What is it like to live in a market where inventory is weirdly low? There's not that many transactions, just not that many new listings. People hang on to their homes a long time. You get bidding wars on the houses that do come to market. They sell in 6 days. All of that was describing just the world you all have been living in California for at least 10 years. Suddenly it became the world, became the housing market the rest of the country had to learn to live with in the last couple of years.
Well, and I think as we look at all the kind of global impacts, and we look at the local impacts here in LA in particular, and in addition to the WGA strike, one thing we haven't mentioned yet, and people that aren't around LA won't care, but is the new Measure ULA, mansionization tax, which tacked on an additional 4 or 5.5%, depending if you were over a $5 or a $10 million benchmark. Santa Monica has a similar one kicking it at $8 million. And, now all of a sudden, we're like bombarded with all these impacts, that the rest of the world are dealing with, plus. Did you want to jump in on that at all, Mike?
Absolutely, be happy to. I think, and both of you led into this, a couple of decades ago, California had roughly 75% of the state were homeowners. I mean, it was very like super majority homeowner state, which led to a lot of legislation and initiatives because we have ballot measures reflecting that reality, right? As this tide has turned, which Jeff calls the California, of the U.S. There, you've seen shifts that lead right into what you're talking about, Billy, because now for the first time, California is majority tenant states, majority renter now. And that's the first time that's happened, right? So you're starting to see a lot more concepts such as statewide rent control, right? These mansionization taxes, right? Because you're going to have policies that follow, the bandwidth of what's happening as a reaction to what we're seeing. So as you see the amount of people who can be homeowners or are part of the homeownership process shrinking, new realities start taking place because, hey, this is a universe where Captain America issue number 1 will sell for $3.1 million, right? Because someone has the money to spend it, right? So it goes back to that supply and demand. But in turn, you might start seeing more and more policy shifts. It was a big deal in 2018 when the mortgage interest deduction, which used to be untouchable, was like, okay, well, now it's only going to go up to a certain level, right? We shouldn't be surprised if we start seeing more, concepts along those roads as homeownership shrinks into a smaller component of the populace.
So, this is, from what I can see from those that are here, it's a lot of agents, but it's also a lot of consumers who are interested to know, how do I make sense of this? What do I do from here? In looking to the past, can we, conjecture for the future and have any kind of reliability? Obviously, we're in an interconnected globe with things that are popping out at us from all directions, whether it's a writer's strike or it's banks failing or debt ceiling crisis. If you look at the Lehman crash, can you compare and contrast where we are today to that? Either of you.
Yeah, I mean the contrasts are numerous. I mean that in that situation, we really had a recession triggered by a financial crisis, by a credit crisis that actually originated in the housing market. And so this was a situation where, yeah, those mortgages going bad and this huge edifice of CDOs and MBS built off of it suddenly went bad. People couldn't trust their collateral. So all this lending does contract. That's, started in the housing market. And so we already had a bunch of foreclosures. We had falling home prices in 2007, 2008, starting to snowball. And then it sort of pushed some dominoes that hit the financial system, leading to a recession. I think it's a very different situation today. And maybe one of the most, so aside from the fact that we don't yet see any sort of distress among homeowners, really zooming in on homeowners, they're actually in crazy good financial shape right now. We've partially through a selection effect where you've had to have pretty sterling credit, solid income, manageable DTI to get a mortgage for several years now. So the people we've led into the homeownership club are doing pretty good. Secondly, then many of them got to refinance down to 3% in the last couple of years, and they've seen their home equity rise. So homeowners are actually in like very, very good shape. And we continue to see very, very low levels of delinquency on mortgages. So in some sense, they're almost the sort of financial bastion of folks who have a low cost of living with that mortgage they locked in and solid credit, and they're looking pretty good. I think if you're looking for some comparisons or some similarities, yes, we are seeing some contraction of credit. I think a lot of that is affecting more small businesses, the kind of folks who rely on regional banks. It is a lot of business loans, commercial real estate. It's a whole nother can of worms at the moment. And, they're getting a bit of the other end of the stick where residential, you got people like me now who need a home office. So I've expanded I needed to buy a house with a home office that I'm calling you from right now last year. At the other end of things, we're shrinking our office footprint because people aren't in the office every day. So the commercial real estate is definitely struggling with that, trying to figure out the new pricing, what the value is if vacancies are so high.
Yeah, I think if you compare the residential experience to the commercial experience, on the one hand, it's much more emotional in the residential area, and we have to ask just handholders and therapists, and that can be, a lot of drama compared to, the commercial world where it's all just a pencil, and yet there's a lot more, I think, strum and driving going on in the commercial world today. And, as difficult as it may feel in the resi world right now, I think we're lucky to be here. Go ahead, Mike, sorry.
Oh, no problem. Billy, what you put forward, and Jeff as well, everything today is connected to things from yesterday, right? There's been a couple articles in the New York Times just in the last few days that are astounding for the wealth of information that they're offering as far as housing in particular, right? Like, for example, we're still up, 40-50% in prices from just a few years ago, right? And if you track back to 1978, which honestly, if you go read articles that were written at the time, it was all about this can't continue, we've hit housing peak, these prices are unsustainable, right? And we've gone up like 500% since then. Right now, we're in the midst of a wealth transfer that has never been seen before, in combination with the fact that what we just saw in real estate in the last couple of years hasn't been seen in economics for over a century, as far as the run up in wealth. There was a study on that from Wharton on that, just that you can't find something similar for how much wealth came about in such a short amount of time. But right now you have a boomer to their heirs, transfer of wealth occurring that's unprecedented. And we're talking like almost over $100 trillion of wealth in the country that's, right now being kicked in different directions and everything. So you have that going on. And just the simple reality that we're dealing with, which is, like Jeff was just saying, this isn't subprime, right? Like the concept of the subprime borrower is gone. You have less than a few 100,000 loans in this country that are of that nature. It's the super prime borrower now, right? around a third of borrowers are sitting on credit scores above 740. And we're sitting on the lowest unemployment that we've seen in over half a century, right? I mean, we can have article or discussion after discussion about when the recession is going to come. The reality is the unemployment rate is 3.4%, right? Unemployment is 3.4. Inflation has been 3.3 for the past 6 months. Wealth is, like it's never been seen before. Whether or not people think things are going to happen externally, the Fed just did a study in 21 and 22, and they're expecting the same results this time, that people personally have never felt better. They feel terrible about what's happening externally, and there's a lot of nervousness about what might happen, but for their personal finances, never felt better, especially those who have what? The means to purchase homes, right? So Gallup just came out with this survey that hit, headlines. We all saw it. The amount of people that think it's a good time to buy a home has never been lower, right? Okay, so let's just dive into that. Basically, 25% of the country thinks it's a great time to buy a home. All right, so that means tens of millions of people think it's a great time to buy a home. How many homes are available? 562,000. So it doesn't matter if 3 out of 4 people don't think it's a good time to buy a home. If 1 out of 4 do, and that equals tens of millions of people, and you only have a few 100,000 of the item that all those people want, well, let's go back to what it was like when you wanted to go get hand sanitizer in the beginning of the pandemic, right? It's just supply and demand. And that's what it comes back to.
Great point. I think Jeff, Jeff, I think you touched on with the Lehman crash. There was we were in a recession at that point as well. I'll start with you, Jeff. But where do you guys feel like we are in terms of being in a recession? If we're not in it, the likelihood that we will or we won't, the soft, hard landing, the tenure of it, et cetera.
Sure. Yeah, I'll take that to start. So I do think there's the elephant in the room to worry about in the near term is the debt ceiling, and so there is sort of like a I can't put a probability on that. I think someone even asked the likelihood of going into default. I think it's low, but we need to take it seriously, and it's people being taking that risk seriously that will hopefully help us avoid going down that path. And so sort of taking it seriously to make sure it doesn't happen is important. Also a bit of a paradox, right? So I don't want to minimize it, but if that gets resolved and that kind of uncertainty stops hanging over things, then I think where we stand is we're still kind of grappling. The biggest problem that we're still grappling with is consumer spending is actually quite strong. The American consumer has been doing well and spending a lot in the last couple of years. And so that's why inflation is really the biggest problem that the Fed is trying to fight. So what's kind of the outlook here? I think there is still a path toward a soft landing. I think that's what the Fed is still hoping for. That, as consumers have spent down that cushion of extra cash that people saved up in 2020 and 2021, they'll start to, rein it back in, tighten their belt, stop spending quite so much. So what could that look like for these big macro things? We could see sort of flatlining GDP. But if we've kind of been running over potential, that could be a chance to cool down, take some of that inflation out of the economy. And, we are starting from an incredibly low unemployment rate, as Mike just said. So what we could have kind of coming out of that is, yes, maybe it's somewhere between a soft landing and a mild recession, where things just kind of cool down, get back on pace, get inflation back under control. I think one of either of those two is quite possible, where I guess the soft landing is actually inflation comes down, we don't enter a recession. Either one of those, I think, is not hugely bearish for housing in particular, because in both of those scenarios, we do see inflation kind of moderating and then hopefully interest rates following.
I can give you an optimistic scenario too.
Okay.
Between 1940 and 1945, the US government pumped, adjusted for inflation, $5 trillion into the economy for World War II, right? And this was known as the epitome of government, like pump priming, and we know the effects, and ended the Depression, et cetera, right? In 2020 and 2021, the government pumped 5.5 trillion, right? I mean, we spent more in 2 years than in all of World War II. And the Fed just did a study on this. So a chunk of our inflation came from this, right? Because they were accounting for a much longer hit of the pandemic that ended up happening, is what happened, right? So that's why the Fed had to come in and do everything they did. The effects, though, after World War II was we saw a run-up inflation in 47, 48, just like we saw a run-up inflation just now. But then that did soft land into an incredible booming economy into the 1950s, right? It wasn't as if we just slid into this like Great Recession for years. There was a soft landing, right? And there are a lot of parallels into what we're seeing right now with what just occurred to what happened in that time period. Discounting, the fact that we don't know the future, obviously, and let's just preface with that. Just the similarities can be there, right? So that can be an optimistic outcome of what we're going through right now, because it's not unnatural that if you pump that much money in that quickly, we have to account for that. And unfortunately, tech and real estate got the biggest hits after being the biggest beneficiaries during the pandemic, right? So that's kind of also a flip side of what's occurring right now.
You mentioned earlier, Mike, about the uniqueness of a Captain America comic book, and you can apply sort of that unique quality as an analogy to homes that may come on the market. And one of the common refrains that we hear from buyers today are, should I buy? One of my typical responses is that, it depends on what it is you're buying and why, and why you're buying. But, assuming that you want to buy, let's just say it's a want as opposed to a need, it would be much nicer to get out of this small house. I can afford it, but, should I buy today? And, I often, though I don't refer to the Captain America comic book, do refer to, types of housing that we see lots of that are kind of popping up like little mushrooms all over the place. And there's always another one. They're somewhat fungible. And then there are those types of properties which are singularly unique. It might be an incredibly special lot. It might be a phenomenal view. It might be extraordinary design, architecture, location, whatever it might be. And they just don't come up that often. What is your, how would you guide buyers now, both as consumers or as agents who are speaking with their buyers? What would be your advice as far as, getting them off the sidelines or giving them the courage and the comfort to jump on into the water, which, appears to many to be frigid?
I've always found that sometimes your most positive information comes within the information that seems like it's the most negative. So I still love this Gallup poll from yesterday or the day before. Record number of Americans don't want to buy a home. And then you go into this and it says, what's the best long-term investment that could be made? Oh, real estate. Same survey, right? Best long-term real estate, no question, right? And it comes down to Lex Luthor, Superman 1, right? Like the best thing you can invest in, real estate. They're not making any more land, right? I mean, it's just a simple fact that if it works for you and your finances account for it, same way my finances allowed me to get this hot chocolate before this event, which has made this event go better for me, right? If your finances allow for you to be able to purchase a commodity that they're not making more of, to be clear, I know, Jeff, I'm sure you know this, but they did a study. There was a Fortune article on this. The supply of housing is growing at less than the rate of the discovery of gold, right? I mean, like, it's like, think about that. So gold is discovered more, right? The pace and percentage increase of like new gold outpaces supply of homes, right? It is a commodity that they're not making that much more of. What's there is what's there. And more people think it's the best long-term investment you can make than anything else. I personally think that's a good thing to own, right? Now, does that mean you should dump everything you have into it and not look back? Of course not. You need to think about your own finances. That's what got us into 2008. But if you have the ability, look at this great article that was written on an interview with the woman who's the head of data for CoreLogic. And she's like, yeah, I know I'm part of the problem. I'm in the home buying process right now, but I refuse to sell my other home because I'm on this great interest rate and I'm renting it out for more than, my mortgage. So why would I let go of it? Right? I mean, homes allow for so much on so many levels. So of course, if you have the ability, it's great to be a homeowner.
Jeff?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That it's a question of, can you afford it? So I think my questions I would ask someone like my little sister who's shopping for a home in Seattle right now is like, is that a home you can afford? And is it a home that you and your family will be happy in for several years? Those are the key questions. Can you afford it? And is that a place where your life is going to be happier living there? Because it's not just some like stock sitting in your portfolio and you're trying to watch, maybe some of us do like check the Zestimate, see like, how's that doing? But most importantly, yeah, it's a place to live. And, as you mentioned, there is so much uncertain about the future. The beauty of homeownership, and especially the beauty of the way mortgages are structured in this country that we're pretty lucky about, is you can take a lot of that uncertainty. What might my rent be? Am I going to get evicted? That comes with being a renter, and replace it with certainty of, okay, my 30-year mortgage, I've got this principal and interest schedule, the amortization table. You get a fixed rate mortgage. You can say, I'm going to be paying $2,000 a month on my mortgage bill from now until 2053 if I stay put here. There's inflation, there's this and that, but that's a big part of my monthly budget that can stay fixed. And so that's why it's important to make sure that was a number you can afford. But if that is a number you can afford, that's an incredible chance to take some of the uncertainty out of the future and lock that in, have a place where you can invest in, painting it, modifying it, expanding it later or whatever. So I think that's key. I do think some of the questions that come back will be, isn't the market going to crash or so on? I want to time the market. Well, timing the market's really, really hard. I think we've just gotten a great illustration of that in the last 12 months. And I don't want to pick on her, but my little sister last fall was saying, okay, the bubble's finally bursting. Prices are coming down. I don't want to buy something whose price is falling. So I'll just wait till the bottom and then I'll buy. Well, by the time the bottom comes in home prices, it might be a little too late to actually buy something like at the bottom. As we've seen, the market just kind of went from 0 to 60 here in Seattle, where suddenly she got out there trying to make some offers, go to open houses this January, February, March. We're back in a multiple offer situation. She got outbid repeatedly. Things are selling really fast. So suddenly, if once it only becomes clear in retrospect what the bottom was. And once you're in that position of that retrospect, there are conditions at play, that market tightness that are going to be working against you a bit. So, as Mike said, when you hear that lots of other people are kind of shying away from buying homes, that is actually something in your favor. That does mean there is still a little less competition than normal at the moment. We're still seeing an elevated number of price cuts on listings. So it's an interesting market out there where there's more heterogeneity than there was in 2021, for instance. So there are still mispriced listings. There are still kind of bargains coming out there where if the house didn't present itself perfectly, you might be able to get it for asking price today or a little under. Whereas, in 2021, every single house was basically going over asking price. So at the moment, there are still a lot of things working in folks' favor. And it just comes back to, can you lock in a house that you would love to live in for the long term and that you can afford?
Yeah, I would also chime in for consumers and for agents, when you're dealing with your clients, either which way. I've always been most fascinated by the concept that you have a buyer and they have an opportunity to get a house and they pause and they're like, well, why doesn't anyone else want it? Right? As if this something hits them. Like, why should I want it if no one else wants it? And I used to say, like, you're asking someone to marry you. Like, do you only do that if 7 people are proposing at the same time? Well, I'm thinking about proposing, but no one else is proposing, so maybe I shouldn't, right? I mean, do you love the house? Because that's the most important question. If there's two regrets that buyers have, it's usually interest rates and, man, why didn't I go for this when there weren't 7 other people trying to buy it at the same time, right? So bottom of the market can simply mean you're not competing with 20 people, okay? And that's a great opportunity.
I love that analogy. I'm going to bring that into my repertoire. You brought up a great point, Jeff, that there's a psychic value that comes with owning a home in a lot different way than it does in owning Bitcoin or having shares in stock and seeing that on your wall. It's so imbued within your persona and your happiness, and it's where you make your memories. It's where you have your life. So there's something more than just its economic investment. I've done studies here in LA where we've been able to demonstrate that if you owned a home for any period of time for at least 7 years, so you could have bought it, before the Lehman crash started to give evidence of the fact that it was slipping away and it was like the ultimate peak. 7 years later, you were still valued more than where you bought it. Is that something that is very specific to LA and Southern California, or is that kind of somewhat more universal?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you do cherry picks or the worst possible window, you can find, someone who bought at the top in 2006, sold in 2012, but who in other markets maybe had a bigger drop. But there are other factors in there, right? You've been paying off the principal. So that's reducing that is increasing your equity dollar for dollar when you pay off the principal. And the folks I know who did that were usually moving. Maybe their family was growing, maybe they relocated for a job. So they sold in 2012, but they also bought in 2012. So they got a bargain on their next house, right? So that purchase by buying at that same time actually turned out to swamp any losses that they had on in that one kind of unique downturn. I think broadly those benefits of building the equity, that kind of forced savings, and the home appreciation that we have had over time does also make the finances of homeownership work out on these long run timelines in a very consistent way.
Well, this is also, literally people voting with their feet, right? You have these 82,513,000 homes and only 562,000 are available for sale right now. So clearly on a percentage basis, it's insane how happy people are that they bought, right? We could go anecdotally and just start knocking on doors, which agents do all over the country, trying to convince people to let go of their home, to which they often politely respond, no, thank you, right? That's why it's so hard, right? And then we have the empirical evidence, which is the incredible vast majority of people, we're talking about 99.9%, don't want to sell this item once they have that item, which means it's an item they are very happy with.
So we only have a little bit of time left, but we touched a little bit about buyers and getting them off the sidelines. What do you say to sellers who think now's not the best time to sell? I'm going to wait for a better day. I'm going to just sit in here. I've got my my great rate. What's that conversation like? And I'm gonna pick on you a moment, Jeff, because when I go on listing appointments so often, I get a seller who says, well, the Zestimate says my house is worth. In fact, I'm going to pitch my house. I'm just going to pocket right now. I'm bringing my house onto the market, and I think the Zestimate says that it's worth $2 million less than I think. I think it's 2.5 less than I think it is, which is like 40% less than what I think it is. So, what do you say to bot sellers, and how do I bridge that gap when the seller says, but it's worth this according to Zillow?
Yeah. So, first of all, the Zestimate is intended as a starting point for getting a ballpark of what that home might be worth. It's built on neural network statistical analysis that's trying to find a set of rules that will enable it to make predictions about 100 million different homes around the country, with the singular goal of trying to reduce that error, is what we call it, between the Zestimate, what it does sell for. The biggest source of that error is just that there's so much we don't know about a home from the outside that the owner and their agent know about it. They know the improvements. They know what makes it special. They know what it's like on the inside, literally, in a way that, the tax assessor or any of these other public sources just have no idea about. So that's, that is a starting point. And yeah, you want to work with the agent to get a sense of what is a valid comp nearby, what is selling recently, and how that is going. I think in the bigger picture, so that's sort of like how should I price this home? But in that bigger picture of why would I sell now, you zoom out, you do go and look at that home price chart going back in time, and home prices are really, really high. They're very close to their all-time high, or they're setting new all-time highs in certain parts of the country right now. So you're going to fetch a lot for that home. You look at time on market in some parts of the country, like Cincinnati, it's 3 days is the median time from listed to pending. We're talking everyone's doing listed on a Friday. They accept an offer by Monday. So homes are selling. And again, that's something that, again, only ever used to happen in California. Now it's happening all over Ohio. So you will sell that home. If you list now at a fair price, you will sell that home quickly. And then, I think the important question for a lot of these folks is, where am I going to live? So part of this is, does it make sense to sell some investment property you've got? And then that's not a problem. But then other folks thinking about, hey, if I've retired here in Seattle, I could go buy a home in Phoenix. And even if I have a mortgage here in Seattle, for the typical homeowner here, they've got enough home equity to buy in cash if they move to Phoenix, right? Because of these gaps. So I think those new possibilities with remote work, that ability to kind of move across the country and kind of tell people, your money would go a lot further in these other places, could be part of the story. And in terms of why would it make sense to sell?
Mike?
I go for inspiration. I think that it's underrated how much emotion comes in on the sell side as often as it does on the buy side. Every listing agent knows it's true. It's why every seller always says, right, like, my house is better than everyone else's house, right? It's because they're emotionally attached to it, right? And I think getting folks inspired about, like Jeff was just saying, where they could go, what they could own, this is going to work way better than anything else. And at the end of the day, look, I'm just going to rip the Band-Aid and be honest about it. Just like in 78 to 82, in that time period, we get every article saying we're in the lowest inventory since 1982. There was a reason, right? It's kind of a brush fire that needs to burn itself out. As more homeowners buy at 5, 5.5, 6, 6.5, and rates are lower, eventually the inventory just picks back up, right? There's a natural, progression of this, right? So right now there's a few million people who have rates, above 5. Over the course of the next year, it will become a few million more. And eventually you're going to have a lot more people who are back in the game of buying and selling a lot more often. And we're going to always have those folks who are sitting under 2-3%, which were just winning, lottery tickets, and they're just going to hold them.
Quick last question, which is something that's been vexing to me, which is, you would think with all of these homeowners sitting on the sidelines, and buyers who are also doing so, that you would see buyers who would say, well, now's not a good time to buy, so I'm going to rent. But it feels to me like the rental market is kind of anemic as well. Any explanations, or is that just my misperception of what's going on?
No, that is a great point. The rental market has cooled down, but it's cooling down from really a boiling point where our national rent index was up 17% year over year in February of last year. That was an all-time record. It has kind of consistently cooled down since then. I think, the relief valve that it's like, okay, people have to live somewhere, right? They either have to be renting or owning. The other thing that can happen is kind of changes in household formation. And so I think part of that was, some renters in 2021 who said, I'm never having a roommate again. I need my own 2-bedroom to have a home office. I could never, share a house with someone anymore. Okay, they got vaccinated. Their rent went up $300. They said, okay, you know what? A roommate sounds like a good idea. I'm going back to the office, so I don't need a home office anymore. So some of this kind of expansion of people's housing appetite in 2021 was able to contract a bit. And I mean, New York, it's incredible to me how the rental market in New York City recovered. Rents started climbing again last year in a big way. Now, once again, it's forcing people to say, you know what, I need a roommate. I need to split the rent. So a bit of that kind of compression may be happening again. But down the line, those folks who are living with roommates into their 30s, they're getting antsy, right? In another few years, they're going to say, okay, I'm sick of a roommate. I want to buy a place of my own.
Yeah, I was going to say it's just like the housing market where, yeah, it's down from its peak, but it's still way up from before. And 70% of the inflation that the Fed was hitting was tied to housing, right? On the sales side and the rent side. So it was a very, dramatic and conscious choice that they were making. They were trying to hit real estate to help bring down that inflation. And they, if you look at their minutes, they feel like they've, succeeded. We're probably not going to see another hike.
Well, thank you guys. I went off script and threw you guys some curveballs, which you guys handled exceedingly well. Again, thank you to Jeff Tucker, senior economist at Zillow, Mike Schwartz, senior vice president at the agency. I'm Billy Rose, co-founder of the agency, and thank you all for joining us. This was an incredible, very insightful, lots of information, lots of data, a great analogy on a proposal, and thank you for joining us today.